Larry, thanks so much for joining us for the Jerome Moross centenary and for contributing to our set of interviews for our documentary and for the archives. It's invaluable to have you here. I just want to start off by asking you a question that I've actually asked quite a few other people, which is how you feel about the tone of Jerome Moross's expressiveness in the light of everyone's knowledge of him being American. We often hear him being called an expresser of Americana. Of course, very much he is. But I've always felt that there's something else there. I've sometimes said to myself, I wonder whether there is something to do with his Jewish roots, only in that there is such a beautiful pathos. I wouldn't say sadness, but pathos, a feeling of gentle beauty of sound often within Americana. That's not to say Americana isn't beautiful, but I wonder whether you know what I'm trying to sort of suggest here and whether you think you agree with me.
Well, I always think, I once jokingly said if I ever wrote a biography, I was going to call it Grandchild of the Depression, because so much of my life growing up was colored by my parents' and grandparents' experience through the Depression. And I guess what I'm trying to say is the period that Copeland and Moross met and worked together originally would have been in the 30s. And there was a great concern in the country. I mean, when I think of Aaron Copland, I think of John Steinbeck, of Mice and Men and Grapes of Wrath. And I think that that's all sort of interrelated into an examination of this country that we had thought was going to be so powerful and so magnanimous, suffering through this period where people were unemployed, people were on breadlines, and there's a great deal of humanity in that suffering that comes through the music. I mean, maybe it's part of the maybe the minor modalities of what we consider ethnic music, like Jewish music or whatever, but there is clearly a compassion that you don't find in some composers who went through that period.
Well, I think that sums it up beautifully, absolutely. Yes. And I mean, to me, immediately that is so evident, isn't it, in this extraordinary piece, Frankie and Johnny, which has compassion underneath the harshness, the terror, really, of the subject that is very terrifyingly expressed a lot of the time, but with such great compassion.
Yes, well, the piece that Frankie and Johnny reminds me of, even though they're very dissimilar, is Aaron Copland's satirical music for the theater. It doesn't have that kind of feeling of the American people that we consider these composers to now embody. It's more of a satiric look at a time and place. And the thing that it shows that also comes through in Frankie and Johnny is this feeling of I'm a young modern composer, and I have been through my schooling, and it's time to start looking at the world as it really is. You know, John Gay, who wrote the Beggar's Opera, says that the world is a comedy if you think, and a tragedy if you have a heart. And there's a lot of brashness in young composers, you know, much more than later. The Leonard Bernstein of 1942 and Fancy Free isn't the same Leonard Bernstein of, let's say, The Mass or Divertimento.
Well, that's an interesting point because, to my ears, the sound of Jerome Moross's writing for the orchestra changed a lot later on, changed after Frankie and Johnny in many ways, although his outlook and the kinds of subjects he set were quite similar often through his career, but the later scores sound quite different, in their orchestration at any rate.
Well, I'm an orchestrator, so let me explain what orchestration is. If you consider a piano piece as a color, I would say a piano piece, let's say the Minuet in G, it's a piece in black and white. When the orchestration comes in, it's the equivalent of coloring a photo. You add varieties of sound to either punctuate what you find in the piece or to simply just give it a bloom. And I usually think of Moross as an orchestrator of other people's work rather than his own. But because he started in Hollywood for working as an orchestrator for Aaron Copland. And last week, for the first time ever, I saw the movie of The Bishop's Wife with Cary Grant and Loretta Young. And Moross did the orchestrations, and they are fantastic. They're very magical. It's a Christmas movie, so it's full of bells and lots of carols and things. And he didn't write the score, but the orchestrations just bring it to life.
I think, don't you, that when he was orchestrating, he was feeling and thinking just in the same way that he was as a composer. He was reacting to the atmosphere and the feeling and the story of whatever the orchestration was for. It's very pictorial orchestration.
Yes, I think his orchestrations for the movie Hans Christian Andersen, which is a Frank Loesser score, are just imaginative and wonderful. They have so much more life than the commercial recordings do. And what I wanted to say about his own orchestrations for himself or anyone's orchestrations for another person is if it's a good collaboration, the orchestra and the orchestrator is working with the composer, very often the orchestrator finds something that the composer never thought of, or vice versa. And sometimes I think that the job of the orchestrator, if the composer hires an orchestrator, is to give a certain emotional level that may not have been there before.
I think, don't you, that this is one of the most remarkable qualities, actually, of Jerome Moross, that actually within his orchestration, it may sound crazy what I'm going to say, it reminds me a little bit of Ravel. That may sound irrelevant, but what I'm getting at is that when you hear Ravel's orchestrations of his piano pieces, actually the orchestration isn't just a colour, it's an added expressive element to me often. And I feel that with Jerome Moross, actually, that his orchestration was more than just superficial colour, it was emotional. And I think that this is one very important reason why when we come later on to, for instance, The Golden Apple, I know he didn't do all the orchestrations, but he did do some of them, didn't he, in important ways. There, with this wonderful composition, the music there can be so very, very touching, with pathos. I use that word again, but often through the orchestration, don't you think?
Listen, anyone who can... The Windflowers makes me burst into tears. The major tragedy of The Golden Apple is that when it was first performed and recorded, they didn't record the entire show. And it's one of those pieces that exists on 40 minutes of music from 120 minutes of music. And you lose so much because there's no feeling for either the continuity of the piece or the compositional ingenuity within every scene. Because the pieces are basically built on the concept of a theme and then variations within that scene. And there are great moments that are totally lost on that recording.
Yes, and for me, one of the big tragedies of that is, of course, the whole scope and design, the ingenious design of the whole piece doesn't come across. And the remarkable way that Moross and John Latouche, it reminds me a little bit of the Offenbach operettas, the way that they have actually so ingeniously taken Greek mythology and transplanted it into another age where it feels similar in one respect and could obviously only be the different age that they are showing on the other hand.
But the difference between Offenbach and Moross is that Offenbach and his librettists were using Greek mythology, which was at that point highly classic and highly serious, to mostly make fun of their own society. And so, La Belle Hélène may be about Helen's abduction by Paris, but it's also about the foibles going on in Paris at the time. The Golden Apple takes Greek and Roman mythology about the Trojan War and the Iliad and the Odyssey and transforms it into American mythology. So, for instance, here's an example. The story of Helen and Paris and her abduction from Sparta to Troy becomes the story of Helen, the farmer's daughter, Paris, the traveling salesman, and the country mice going to the big city to rescue her. And so it's no longer about epic heroes and Greek towns. It's about things that happen in America that had become part of American folklore.
And Larry, there seems to me to be a sort of very remarkable quality in the sentiment of the Golden Apple that although it's very much an affectionate picture of America, in many ways it seems to me that it is satire, don't you think?
Well, it is in the three ladies, the three goddesses who caused the trouble. They are clearly satirical because what John Latouche, I don't know how much Moross had to do with the libretto, but John Latouche is saying to the audience, because the ladies who play Lovey Mars, the matchmaker, and Mrs. Juniper, the mayor's wife, and Minerva Oliver, the schoolteacher, come back in Act Two in the big city as their equivalents on a much higher social level. So the schoolteacher becomes the mad scientist, Mrs. Juniper becomes the celebrity gathering rich hostess, and the matchmaker, Lovey Mars, becomes this siren down at the local dive. And so, but he's saying these types exist everywhere. You know, they are not the same people they were in, what's the name of the town? Angel's Roost is the name of the town in Washington State. These ladies are not the same ladies in Angel's Roost, but these ladies exist in every town. And so, and part of the thing with the story of Ulysses and Penelope, which is basically the real vestige of the Odyssey, is that they find a way to transform all of Odysseus's various travails as he returns to Ithaca on an American scale. So in the Odyssey, Scylla and Charybdis are these monsters that his ship has to pass through. They will devour the men on his boat. And in the Golden Apple, Scylla and Charybdis become a stock firm, and his men are lost in lousy stock investments. They end up killing themselves, jumping out the window. And I like the fact, too, that the mayor of the equivalent of Troy, which is Hector Charybdis, because he's part of the stockbroking team of Scylla and Charybdis. Hector is the mayor of the town, but he's also a vaudeville song and dance man. He's not a trained singer. He's primarily a dancer who can do a buck and wing. And so they're not only bringing in the mythology of the traveling salesman and the farmer's daughter and the big city, and they're bringing in also all these theatrical jokes. Here comes, oh look, here's some vaudeville turn. And like Sondheim's musical Follies, all of those sequences in Act Two, when Ulysses gets to Rhododendron, are all about vaudeville turns. The mad scientist has hers where she sends a man off into space. Mrs. Juniper has hers when she's kissing up to all the heroes, and then they find that they're no longer celebrities. And they're all interrelated like a Follies sequence.
Yes, and in its design as well as its content, it's way ahead of its time, really, isn't it?
Yes, but the most prescient part of the libretto is in the first act, where Ulysses is raving about how wonderful the future is going to be and how he and Penelope should step out and see the big city and encounter some fun. And Mother Hare, who is the wicked witch of the story, puts her crystal ball up to his face and says, "What do you see?" He says, "I see desolation. I see forests chopped down. I see barren fields." I mean, it's the concern for the ecology of the country was nothing in 1954, and here's John Latouche writing about it. I mean, it's like the Silent Spring 10 years earlier.
And there's such a range of expression in the Golden Apple. I mean, some of it is to me very moving, actually.
Well, even a funny song, or not a funny song, but let's say the great ballad, Lazy Afternoon, it's very melancholy. I mean, it's Paris' seduction of Helen, but in the actual show, it's Helen's seduction of Paris. And she's vamping him with this, like a torch song. But there's a real tragedy undercurrent to it. The lines about the fat pink cloud and so on, they're very erotic and they're very steamy, but there's a certain sadness under that whole song.
I think, unfortunately, Lazy Afternoon is a case of one particular piece of music, one particular composition that has become so popular that its popularity has actually gone against it, by which I mean I don't think many people, it's such a popular piece, it's been arranged so many times and performed so many times, I wonder how many people really understand its context, its subtle, many-sided context in the original Golden Apple, which is important because those overtones and those subtleties and those contradictions are so much part of the expression in its original form, and I don't think so many people really realise that.
Well, what's interesting about that number in terms of the scene it takes place in within the musical is that the scene begins with the orchestra playing this sultry tango. And the character of Paris is played by a dancer who never speaks. He dances everything. And so the whole sequence is basically him dancing this tango around Helen. And then suddenly she bursts into this wonderful ballad. And by the end of the number, she's got his clothes off. And then she says, "All right, my dear, you talked me into it." And she runs in the house and grabs the silverware and everything and starts throwing it all into his balloon so they can elope together. But it's so strange, this ballad coming out of basically this erotic tango. And then in terms of the original scoring for the ballad, the Lazy Afternoon, it's a lot of vibes. It's mostly the voice and the vibraphone.
We have Kay Ballard taking part in this project, and she told us about how she auditioned for the role that she sang and how that song, Lazy Afternoon, made her feel so passionate that she just felt she had to take part. And, of course, she was cast as a wonderful interpreter of not only that song, but the whole role. And I just wonder if you have any information for us at all about the remainder of the cast, that's to say the casting, I should say, really, how both Moross and Latouche went about that.
Well, I'm sure that they had people in mind. The question would be, since I do a lot of casting for things I work on, you often are stuck with, all right, I lost my first choice. Who do I go with? And the Phoenix Theater downtown was an off-Broadway theater. I don't know if they were paying Broadway scale. I doubt it. So I'm sure there were a lot of agents who didn't particularly want to submit a person for one of their actors for an off-Broadway job. And of course, who knew when the show was being cast it would ever transfer to Broadway? It didn't last long. It lasted about 4 months on Broadway. But if you want your client to go get a Broadway job so that you get a bigger 10% than you do if they're playing an off-Broadway show, you've got to hope that people will show up. There was some cast replacements when it went from the Phoenix to Broadway. I suspect some had to do with people who had signed contracts for other jobs. And some people may not have wanted to stay with the show. You never know. There were at least 3 ladies who played Mrs. Juniper. The first was Geraldine Vitti. The second was Shannon Boland, who then went on to play Meg in The Pajama Game. That's the wife of the older version of Joe Hardy. And the third was Charlotte Ray, who then went off to the Theatre de Lys and created Mrs. Peachum in Mark Wittstein's translation of Threepenny Opera. And Priscilla Gillette, who played Helen, was a soprano from New York City Opera. And she had actually just done Cole Porter's show, Out of This World. She played the Andromeda character in that. And and Stephen Douglas, who played Ulysses, then went to do Damn Yankees with Shannon Bolan. He played the young version of her husband. And the person I don't know anything about is Nola Day, who was the original Mother Hare. And she left the show, and Martha Larimore replaced her. And I think it's Martha Larimore on the recording. I don't think the recording was made till the show moved uptown.
It's frustrating that we really only have about a third of the entire score on that recording. Of course, as I'm sure you know, we can't use it on our documentary for copyright reasons, but of course recordings do exist of the complete Golden Apple, which is the only way to appreciate it. There's so many of these gaps in the commercial discography, anyhow, of Jerome Moross. This is something we're wanting to change. We very much hope through the awareness of his wonderful art that's going to come across through our documentary. And I mean, another work that is completely unavailable, of course, is Gentlemen Be Seated. Now, that had a checkered career anyhow, didn't it? For a number of reasons.
Well, they certainly couldn't get a Broadway producer to handle it. And it ended up on basically a week's run by New York City Opera. And like the Golden Apple, it had its enthusiasts. There were people who were writing letters to the Times saying, "Bring back Gentlemen Be Seated." And I find it a tragedy that this score, which has got great numbers in it, is unknown.
Well, now, there's another work of Jerome Moross that's completely unrepresented in the commercial catalogue. There is a private recording available of it, which I think is an extraordinary piece, and that is the one and only real sort of fully fledged opera he wrote. I mean, The Golden Apple is an opera, isn't it really? But I'm talking about Sorry Wrong Number. Now, that is an amazing piece, and I think, I'm not sure if I'm right, but I think that was the first of what was going to be a trilogy of operas that he was going to compose, I think.
Now, that I don't know. I edited the score for publication, and I kept reading through it thinking, oh, I really want to hear this. I'm very curious to know what this sounds like. And it's a piece that I admire because it has to build to a dramatic conclusion where he kills her, where she's killed. But I would love to actually see it done to find out if it works. It's one of those pieces that when you're reading it and working on it and you're looking at making sure the notes are right and everything's falling into place, you don't have time to think about, does this play to an audience? Because it's basically a one-act opera with a woman lying in a bed on a telephone trying to get someone to come and save her from being killed. And it's the other voices and the interruptions that provide the tension and whether or not she's going to be rescued. And would it play to an audience and keep them gripped to their seats thinking, wow, this is exciting? Or are they going to think, oh, just kill her?
Larry, if I just can give a little personal response to you, I really think it would. It would be difficult to make it work. You know, there are those operas, those few operas that have been composed that are all just about tension. I mean, another one, for instance, Bluebeard's Castle of Bartók, and where you've got something where there's no real action, but it's all in the mind and it's all fear, and is it going to happen or is it not going to happen? That's where it seems to me there is the ability of the composer in a really remarkable work to make it incredibly intense if you've got the performers that can realise what he wanted. And I think that Jerome Moross has absolutely contained that in his score, but it would be very difficult to bring off, maybe. That's something that I do feel, because it would need artists, or particularly the principal artist of the invalid woman in bed, she would have to have an enormously careful control of her emotional and dramatic responses. But I think it's all there, personally, if I may say so. I just wish that he had lived longer to write further operas and more music. Well, Larry, thank you very, very much indeed for giving us your insights, your experience, and your wonderfully eloquent observations on Jerome Moross for the centenary. It's been delightful to speak with you. We're very grateful indeed. Thank you very, very much indeed for giving us this conversation. It's been a real delight to speak with you.
Thank you. You too.